I'm Tomáš Valášek, Director of Carnegie Europe. And I have the distinct privilege and pleasure, really, of welcoming America's most senior diplomat for Europe, Assistant Secretary of State, Wess Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell needs little introduction, but as Henry Kissinger has once grumbled, just because I don't need an introduction doesn't mean that I don't like to get one. So you will. Dr. Mitchell, prior to joining the State Department in October of last year, right, spent 12 years at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, the last 8 of those as its president and CEO. He also served on the advisory boards of, among other organizations, the Zbigniew Brzezinski Institute for Geostrategy, the Prague Center for Transatlantic Relations, Atlantic Initiative Berlin, and the Slovak Atlantic Commission. Excellent choice, if I may say so. Among those who follow transatlantic relations informally, of course, Assistant Secretary Mitchell is no stranger. He has been long known to many of us in this room as one of the top scholars of European history. His latest book, by the way, explains how the Habsburg Empire, short on armies and long on disagreements among the constituent nations, has nevertheless managed to dominate most of Central and much of Western Europe. And I will avoid the temptation to make any analogies with the European Union of today. Before I venture any further, let me also acknowledge the gracious help of the US mission to Europe and Chargé d'Affaires Adam Shabir, who will be missing and when he leaves soon, who are our partners in organizing today's event. And allow me to also note, if only for GDPR compliance purposes, that we are live streaming the event. So this is a welcome not only to those many in this room, a distinguished audience indeed, but also to the multitudes who are watching us on YouTube and on Facebook. Welcome. Assistant Secretary, you come to Europe at a highly unusual time, to say the least. A lot of the established truths about the transatlantic relationship are being turned on their head. We look forward to hearing from you, so no further ado, allow me to invite you to the stage.
Thank you, Tomáš, for that very warm introduction. And I tell you, the feelings are entirely mutual. I appreciate the friendship that I've developed with Tomáš over the years, have great respect for him as an intellectual and former policymaker. And I want to applaud the great work that he's doing here at Carnegie Europe, which is a very important institution in the transatlantic relationship. I know he's brought a lot of energy and vision to this role, and am really pleased to see the work that Carnegie is doing on the really essential job of strengthening the transatlantic relationship in Brussels, which is what I hope to work on today as well. It's also good to see many friends in the audience. I appreciate all of you getting together. Let me start by stepping back in European history. This is a year of many anniversaries, so I tried to pick one that would be an appropriate starting point for talking about the transatlantic relationship. And I want to go back 70 years. 70 years ago this week, to when Joseph Stalin was preparing to blockade West Berlin. In the days that followed, Soviet forces cut off access to the city of Berlin by all routes: rail, water, road, and air. In response to that, Harry S. Truman ordered what would become the largest airlift in history. Over the course of a year, the U.S. Air Force, together with the Air Forces of France and the British Commonwealth, would fly more than 1.5 million tons of supplies to the people of Berlin. Food, medicine, coal, toys, candy, everything needed to keep a city alive. And because of that effort, 2 million German citizens were saved from starvation. But I think more than that, Stalin saw for probably the first time that the United States was serious about strategic competition, about protecting the fragile states of post-war Europe from Soviet aggression. The Cold War that ensued would be the third and longest global conflict of the 20th century. On 2 earlier occasions, once in 1917 and once in 1941, the United States had used its massive resources to arm, fund, and lead great alliances to free the European continent. These conflicts had cost America a lot in lives and treasure to win. Lives of men like my relative, Carl Hart from Aspermont, Texas, who was shot by a German sniper near the Rhine in January 1945. After the war, Americans wanted to bring their sons and daughters home. That's exactly what we had done after the First World War. But this time was different. This time America did not leave Europe when the shooting stopped. We stayed and rebuilt Europe. We dug Europe's great cities out of the rubble. We shipped tons of supplies, food, clothing, fuel for winter, heavy equipment. We shipped all of that to Europe to resurrect European civilization. We built permanent military bases. We laid the foundations for NATO. We funded the Marshall Plan, more than $110 billion in today's terms. And we insisted that Europe's nations drop trade barriers and coordinate to rebuild one another. We supported the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, the forerunner of the European Union. In making that decision to rebuild Europe, America wanted to ensure that our sons and daughters would not have to intervene in yet another European war. Our aim was to make the West economically and militarily strong, to deter a conflict before it could start. We saw in 1948 what we had failed to see in 1918, that strategic competition would continue even though the shooting had stopped, and that we would have to remain committed over the long haul to win that competition and avoid the old cycle of reaction that had cost us so much in previous wars. So better to be in Europe and deter threats than wait until they had metastasized and have to intervene on terms not of our own choosing. Taking that path was not cheap or easy. We take it for granted today that America would rebuild Europe after World War II, but it was far from a foregone conclusion at the time. Such a thing was new to American political culture. Americans were tired of war. They wanted to demobilize, cut defense budgets, and return to the business of peace at home. The fact that they did not do those things, that they stayed and rebuilt, has provided the foundation for the world as we know it today. Working together, our grandparents' generation turned off the old fire trap, as George Kennan called it, the fire trap of Europe in the 20th century. A fire trap that had brought 2 European wars in a little more than a generation. And from those ashes, they built up the modern West, centered on the great nations of the North Atlantic Basin, into a place of democratic freedom, enormous wealth, stability, and strength. Fast forward 70 years. Today, the Western Alliance faces new challenges that few of us could have imagined in the days immediately following the end of the Cold War. A reanimated and militarily aggressive Russia, a China that is exerting economic and military influence across Central Asia into the Caucasus and Central and Eastern Europe, and Iran that has expanded its strategic reach from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Israel and the shores of the Mediterranean. Islamic extremism capable of reaching into the very heart of Europe. Migration on a scale not seen since the population movements at the end of the Second World War. The question for today's generation is not unlike the one that Americans and Europeans faced in 1948. Strategic competition is heating up, and it is here to stay for the long term. Do we have the will and resources to engage in and win that competition over the long haul, even when it will require us to make decisions that may not be comfortable or easy for our societies today? As President Trump said in Warsaw, do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it? The United States is doing its part to ensure that we do. That job begins at home, where we are working to strengthen America militarily and economically for the years ahead. We are rebuilding our defenses, recapitalizing a neglected nuclear arsenal, and reversing years of cuts that had reduced the U.S. Navy to its smallest size since before the First World War. We are rebuilding an economy that for decades has seen U.S. manufacturing jobs move overseas, stimulating investment, cutting regulations, restoring growth, and fighting to give American companies a fair chance in international markets. Since January of last year, nearly 3 million American jobs have been created. The unemployment rate has dropped to its lowest number in nearly 20 years. Jobless claims have fallen to levels not seen in 44 years, and job openings have reached the highest levels ever recorded. All of that is good for Americans, but it's also good for our allies and for the world. American strength is the central pillar upon which not only our own U.S. security rests, but your security here in Europe rests as well. If that foundation is vulnerable, all that we believe in, all that we ground our strength upon, democracy, markets, deterrence, all of that is vulnerable as well. Our job today is to preserve the West as the world moves into an era of fiercer geopolitical competition. That cannot happen without Europe participating energetically in the task. America and Europe are the West and the heart of the free world. Europe is the backbone of our international alliance system and by far our largest economic partner. But more than that, America and Europe are bound together by bonds of history, heritage, and culture, by kinship and shared sacrifice. No two regions on Earth share an alignment of values on anything remotely similar to what unites Europe and America. In a century that is shaping up to see intense battles of ideas, we stand for the cause of freedom that since antiquity has been the foremost gift of Western civilization to the world. China, Russia, and Iran, each in their own way, are would-be ideological competitors to the West. China and Russia represent a coherent model, stability founded on authoritarianism and brute force, harnessed to certain aspects of market competition, and commingled, it's worth adding, commingled with state-run politicization of the economy. Iran and ISIS are also authoritarian and stand for political Islam in its ugliest form, muscular, repressive, and dogmatic. What all of these have in common is a negation of the individual, a building up of the central authority, whether secular or theocratic, over the liberties of the individual, an eagerness to repress and punish anything that challenges the state, an embrace of kleptocracy and corruption to enrich those who rule the state. All of these things are antithetical to the political traditions of the West, which above all were built on the idea that the individual is to be protected from abuses of state power. We stand for democracy over autocracy, for the freedom of the individual over the centralizing apparatus of the state, for the rights of the weakest against the arbitrary power of the strong, for law above politics and right above might. Our interests also are closely aligned. America and Europe share a fundamental interest in seeing the world remain free of the scourge of great power war. We share an interest in seeing Europe's territorial integrity protected, in seeing Russia held accountable for the invasion of Ukraine and not allowing that precedent to be repeated elsewhere, in preventing the use of chemical weapons from becoming the norm, in dealing effectively with China's currency manipulation, dumping, and wholesale theft of intellectual property rights, in seeing our cities secure from terrorist attack and our youth linked by cultural and economic exchange, in seeing the Balkans reformed and on the path to Europe, and Europe free of Russian energy blackmail, in keeping the sea lanes open for commerce, and in keeping transatlantic trade, commerce, and investment strong. To see how much unites us, just compare American and European perspectives to China or Russia. China elects its president for life. Russia uses force to redraw borders and supports a Syrian regime that uses chlorine gas against children. Neither protects the individual, respects rule of law, freedom of press, assembly, or speech. For both, human rights are an afterthought. The scale of what unites America and Europe can also be seen in how much we are doing together, at home and all around the world. Every day, Americans and the EU conduct, on average, $5.2 billion in two-way trade, more than $1.1 trillion a year in goods and services. Every morning, around 15 million Americans and Europeans go to work in jobs created by each other. Every day, 35,000 U.S. troops wake up at bases in Germany, 12,000 in Italy, and nearly 5,000 in Poland and Eastern Europe. Every day, U.S. and European soldiers, sailors, and airmen march, sail, and fly alongside one another on patrols as far-flung as the Baltic, Black Sea, Mediterranean, Middle East, North Africa, and Afghanistan. Every day, something like 74,000 tourists, vacationers, and business people board more than 1,000 airplanes to cross the Atlantic for mostly visa-free travel in what is by far the highest volume of travel between any two regions on Earth. I think I've been on about half of those airplanes in the past week. Every day, U.S. and European law enforcement officials coordinate on everything from customs and border security to human trafficking and international narcotics. Our intelligence agencies share information and satellite feeds on scores of threats to keep us safe. Our scientists and researchers collaborate on projects in medicine, engineering, and IT. Every day, our diplomats work together to tackle the world's toughest problems. They coordinate on Ukraine, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, and Afghanistan, on counterterrorism, global health problems, and nuclear nonproliferation. We coordinate strategy, aid, and even trips among our officials with one another in the Western Balkans, on normalization in Serbia, Kosovo, and reform in Bosnia. Last week, US, EU, German, French, and British diplomats coordinated by phone for hours with one another and with Greek and Macedonian officials to reach a deal on the name issue. And last week in Singapore, a historic breakthrough was achieved with North Korea after years of coordination between the United States and Europe, culminating in a joint campaign of maximum pressure. The scale of what unites us can even be seen in our disagreements. The history of transatlantic relations has been marked by debate and crisis from the earliest days. Roosevelt and Truman disagreed with Churchill about how to handle Stalin. I think Churchill was right. De Gaulle disagreed with 5 consecutive American presidents on virtually every major foreign policy issue in transatlantic relations for about 20 years. Eisenhower disagreed with Eden and Coty over Suez. Kennedy disagreed with Macmillan over Skybolt. Reagan and Kohl disagreed over Pershing II. Over the decades, Americans and Europeans have disagreed about everything from Vietnam and the Iraq War to the Kyoto Climate Accords and Google. We have had and continue to have scores of disputes with one another at the WTO on commercial airplanes, poultry, beef, biotech, steel, this is not the first one, bananas, and chemicals. But at every turn, we have found a way to come together for the simple reason that what unites us in values, interests, trade, and security is vastly greater than what divides us. We are bound by ties of history, culture, and kinship that cannot be broken by even the most passionate disagreement on policy. That is as true today as it was in past decades. Consider, for example, the issue of Iran. The United States recently made a decision to withdraw from the JCPOA. In doing so, we sent a clear message to Tehran's leaders that we are determined to confront the full scale of Iran's malign influence across the Middle East. As Secretary Pompeo said recently, no more cost-free expansion. While many Europeans disagreed with our decision, we know from months of close dialogue with our allies that they and we are in full agreement on the extent of the Iranian problem and the need to take steps together to deal with it more effectively. Today, we are working with allies from Europe and the Middle East to do exactly that. We will succeed together in this task. Or consider the issue of burden sharing. In recent months, the United States has called more urgently than ever for our allies to meet the 2% threshold in defense spending. Some allies do not like to hear this message. They remind us that they face political and economic pressure at home to keep defense spending low. So do we. Imagine telling moms and dads from Texas or Kansas that their sons and daughters must defend a Europe that is unwilling to defend itself. It is U.S. security provision, paid for by U.S. taxpayers, that for 70 years has allowed Europeans to shift their public outlays from defense to things like free education and health care. We urge our allies to honor the commitments made at Wales and the Brussels leaders meeting. We applaud the growing number who have already done so. Since January of last year, every member of NATO but one has increased defense spending. The number that will spend 2% of GDP on defense by 2024 has more than tripled from 5 to 18. The number allocating at least 20% of GDP to major equipment purchases has more than doubled from 14 to 26. And the alliance as a whole has increased defense spending by 5.2% or $14.4 billion, the largest one-year surge in defense spending in a generation. We will succeed together in this task. Or consider the issue of trade. After World War II, the United States opened up its domestic markets to European allies' imports on a non-reciprocal basis. We did so to help Europe rebuild itself from the wreckage of war. We continued that policy toward former rivals after the Cold War. It is the root of a trade deficit of $140 billion with Europe and $350 billion with China. Today, we sit on systemic imbalances in global trade that make a mockery of the rules-based economic order. After letting China into the WTO, that country has conducted large-scale theft of intellectual property, dumped its products on a grand scale, and refused reciprocity in trade and investment. The EU, too, presents an unfair playing field to U.S. companies. The United States recently made the decision to take action against years of Chinese steel dumping. In doing so, we have prioritized fair and reciprocal trade. We want to eliminate the inequities and imbalances that have developed in our trade relations over the years. That is necessary to strengthen the transatlantic relationship and ensure that it can continue to be strong and serve both American and European interests. For this reason, President Trump has emphasized his desire to one day see no tariffs, subsidies, and trade barriers among the nations of the West and between the world's most developed economies. As Secretary Ross has said, we are open to finding a joint way to address steel and aluminum tariffs that allows us to jointly confront the shared problem of Chinese overcapacity. We are ready to work together with our EU partners to improve market access, remove tariff and regulatory barriers to trade, and counteract unfair third country practices. We will succeed in this task together. In all of these areas, Iran, defense spending, trade, we are committed to finding a common way forward. We are committing to acting. We can debate, we can strategize and coordinate, but we must act. We cannot continue to defer action on things that make the West collectively weaker against its rivals. Failing to address Iranian military ingenuity, influence, and support for terror will put the West at a disadvantage in the future. Not spending 2% on defense, having atrophied European militaries whose submarines cannot swim and airplanes cannot fly, that puts the West at a disadvantage in the future. Building pipelines like Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream that increase Europe's dependency on gas from Russian energy monopolies, that puts the West at a disadvantage. And failing to address structural trade imbalances and predatory trading practices, that too is something that will weaken the West in the years ahead. Taking strong positions on these issues may not always lead to immediate agreement, but the long-term costs of neglecting these things far outweigh whatever political unity today. In taking strong positions, we are not targeting our allies. We are countering those like Russia, Iran, and China that are putting our collective security at risk. In the actions we take, we are hoping to spur a multilateral response to address some of the world's toughest challenges. We urge our allies to be strategic actors and to take these and other threats to Western security more seriously than they have in the past. And we are ready to work together to find a common way forward. In tackling these and other problems, we are ready to work with Europe in all its forms. Ahead of next month's NATO summit, we are preparing one of the most extensive agendas in the alliance's recent history. In addition to burden sharing, that agenda will include two other substantive planks: strengthening NATO deterrence and defense, and expanding efforts to fight terrorism and project stability in the South. At the summit, we will unveil U.S.-led initiatives to improve force readiness, mobility, and decision-making, without which the steps pledged at Wales and Warsaw cannot realize their full potential. We will introduce new U.S.-driven command structure adaptation and a U.S. commitment to establish a new headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, on North Atlantic security, as well as new counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan and a new mission in Iraq. We will also ensure that NATO has the right capabilities to respond effectively to hybrid and cyber challenges, and we will significantly expand the scope of NATO's responsibilities across its southern frontier. By transforming the activity in Iraq to a mission, we will send a signal of NATO's long-term commitment to that country, broaden the effort to defeat ISIS, and ensure the coalition retains its hard-won battlefield gains against this death cult. In tandem, we will expand cooperation with southern partners to confront terrorism, trafficking of weapons, regional instability, and illegal migration. America also works closely with the European Union. Altogether, at present, we maintain more than 35 ongoing structured dialogues with the EU on everything from security and energy to trade and human rights. The EU stood with us, first in imposing and then continuing to renew sanctions on Russia in the period since the start of its aggression in Ukraine. It is also a critical partner in counterterrorism. We work closely with Europol and the EU Counterterrorism Center to staunch the flow of foreign terrorist fighters and improve information sharing on potential threats. We coordinate with the EU on protecting its borders, and we coordinate on energy security, where the EU shares our concerns about Nord Stream 2 and shares our support for projects like the Southern Gas Corridor and the interconnector Greece-Bulgaria. We support the EU effort to improve European defense capabilities. But NATO is the chief guarantor of European security, and as such, any EU defense efforts must strengthen rather than weaken NATO. PESCO can help ensure and enhance European security only if it is coordinated with and reinforces NATO. Otherwise, it duplicates capabilities at a moment when the overwhelming task before us is to build capabilities that in many European countries do not exist at all. We therefore support NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg's 3 principles: that nations not have 2 separate sets of capability requirements, that capabilities developed under PESCO be available to NATO, and that non-EU NATO allies be involved in PESCO. In addition to NATO and the EU, America works closely with European nations. Europe is home to many great nations, which are fonts of history, language, and culture. Nations have the first and most basic claim on our natural affections. They are the seat of sovereignty and popular democracy, and the foundation of law and civic patriotism. Some of Europe's nations are small, some are large, some are new democracies, some are old democracies. Some are in the EU, some are not. Some are in NATO, some are not. All are part of the West. The United States maintains thriving bilateral relationships with all. There is, for example, our relationship with France, America's oldest ally, a military partner of inestimable value, and from the time of de Gaulle, a world nuclear power that contributes tangibly to the deterrence that makes up the deepest foundation of security for the Western world. Today, Washington and Paris cooperate in a range of fields where French national power is indispensable to Western security. Syria and Lebanon, where France brings a wealth of unique experience and relationships from long history. The Sahel and North Africa, where France has shown leadership in dealing proactively with long incubating but under-addressed threats. There is our special relationship with the United Kingdom, a great nation linked more than any other in the world by history and kinship to the United States. We will maintain that special relationship long after Brexit has run its course. We view Brexit as a sovereign democratic decision of the British people. We do not seek to influence the content of the Brexit negotiations, but we do join other allies around the world in urging the EU and the United Kingdom to move this process forward swiftly, without unnecessary acrimony, with maximum care for Northern Ireland, where we underscore our support for continued peace, with an eye to retaining the UK's place at the heart of transatlantic decision-making, and with a view to reinforcing the long-term stability of the US-European economic relationship. There is our close friendship with Germany, one of America's most powerful trading partners and a linchpin of Europe's economic and political stability. There is Italy, a country with deep cultural, economic, and military ties to the United States, who more than any other European state has borne the brunt of the economic and humanitarian disaster that is the Mediterranean migrant crisis. There is the Netherlands, who aided America in our own revolution and is among our closest trading and security partners. There are Poland and the Baltic states, who more than any other have borne the brunt of European security against Russia. There are the Nordic states, close security partners, whose diplomats work in quiet, skillful tandem with the United States to confront some of the world's hardest challenges. There are Spain and Portugal, 2 of America's most effective maritime allies. There's Romania, Europe's sentinel on the Black Sea, and a state that has made historic progress in the fight against corruption. There's Greece, which sits on a rapidly expanding strategic frontier and is emerging as both a source of stability and leader in the Balkan Peninsula. And there is Turkey, which occupies NATO's southernmost frontier and is a linchpin of our efforts to defeat ISIS and impede the flow of irregular migration to Europe's southern shores. In working with each of these nations, as we do in a variety of ways with all other European nations, we embrace the political and geopolitical plurality that is and has always been Europe. Like previous generations of Atlanticists, We must work with Europe in all its forms to strengthen the West as a whole. It is in the West's collective interest, as we head into an era of intensified geopolitical competition, to see Europe itself also embrace this plurality of political traditions, threat assessments, national legal approaches, and to find strength in them. In all of these areas, our task is to ensure that the West as a whole is stronger for geopolitical competition that will be more intense than we could have foreseen at the end of the Cold War. Stronger externally in our defense policies, proactive handling of frontier threats and protection of national borders, stronger internally in our economies, energy policies, and above all, in our will and confidence as a political civilization. Strengthening the West means making hard decisions today even when we initially disagree, rather than continuing to accept the appearance of transatlantic unity for the sake of avoiding disagreement. Our job today is one of strategic renovation, doing the hard work of shoring up and strengthening the West now so that we don't have to do so later on terms that are less favorable. As at the time of the Berlin airlift, we must take responsibility for and show resourcefulness in preparing for the long-term competition that lies ahead of us. Together, we will succeed in this task. Thank you for having me.
Great, many thanks. The Assistant Secretary has we will have about 20 minutes for debate, perhaps a little less, which is time for only so many questions. So what we thought we would do is we've invited questions from you in advance. We've gotten quite a few. We've responded with a vengeance. I think I have enough questions for about 20 hours of debate. So I apologize in advance to those whose questions I will not be able to take. But what I will try to do is hit all the major themes. Let me begin, if you don't mind, Assistant Secretary, with some of the tough issues. You've delivered what was a very eloquent and passionate call, or rather restatement of the continued importance of the West as a political community as well as a security community. But do you as a transatlanticist or as an Atlanticist worry that there is a point of break, that if you overload the alliance with differences and disagreements on steel, aluminum, cars, Iran, that there might be a point where cooperation on the big issues, Russia, China, does begin to suffer? And in particular, when some of the key European countries begin to feel that the US policy, the United States is actually intervening in their domestic politics these days. Do you think that is still consistent with the continued strength and health of a transatlantic alliance? And do these points come up in the interagency debates? I mean, is there any point where we hit a pause and say, these are allies? Perhaps they need to be treated differently from, say, China.
I do think the number of points of disagreement that we have between the United States and Europe right now is something that should concern Atlanticists on both sides of the Atlantic. I root my confidence, first and foremost, in the fact that the transatlantic alliance has undergone a lot of strain in its history. This is not our first rodeo. For a long ways back, we've had some rocky eras. We've always pulled together. I tell you, though, I also look at this question, and I'm always careful to distinguish between the appearance of transatlantic political unity, which I think we often accepted in the past as a goal in its own right. And I juxtapose that to the task of strengthening the West. A lot of people could look at what the United States is doing today in our foreign policy. I get this question often, the question of, how is it that you say you want to strengthen the West when we have this number of disagreements? And what I would say in response to that is, strengthening the West is about making hard decisions now in areas of trade and security. Our political elite and publics may not always be comfortable with these things. But I would take that over the appearance of unity that may leave unresolved some things that, if they don't get resolved, are going to make us weaker. And I look at, you look at the major disputes today. You look at JCPOA or disagreements on steel, Nord Stream 2, burden sharing. None of these are things that are in the narrow American self-interest. All of these are things that if in a few years we can look back and say, we addressed imbalances in the transatlantic trade relationship, we got a non-proliferation and deterrence framework in place to deal with Iran, we killed Nord Stream 2, and we got certain countries in Europe to spend 2% on defense who for decades prior to that would not. I would say that we're doing something tangibly to strengthen the West.
Great. Can I pick on one of these four? You mentioned specifically the idea of tariffs. You described the words being used at the G7 summit as sort of a restatement of U.S. desire to have a non-tariff zone between the United States and Europe. To many of us in Europe, it's come as a bit of a surprise. So where would you describe on a scale from an early idea to an actual statement of intent with the will to follow up? Where would you describe the idea of sort of a tariff-free zone to be in Washington? I mean, is this, again, an early idea which may or may not happen, or is this a sign of things to come? Will it be an earnest negotiation to follow up?
You know, I think President Trump has been very clear on more than one occasion that he wants to move towards a lowering of barriers. Our concern is that there is a lack of reciprocity in so many areas of U.S.-European trade. U.S. and Europe generally maintain some of the lowest trade barriers in the world. European tariff and non-tariff barriers, on balance, are higher than those of the United States. I'm encouraged by the fact that when the United States and Europe had the TTIP negotiations underway, we agreed on 90 or 95% of that agenda. We disagreed on some things pretty passionately, agriculture and other things, but I think the U.S. desire continues to be reciprocal trade. What we don't want to continue doing is asking the American people to bear the shoulder, first in the Atlantic trade zone, but most importantly, vis-a-vis China, for very unfair trade practices that make a mockery of the idea of a rules-based economic order. We invited China into the WTO on the assumption that doing so would have a liberalizing effect on the Chinese economy and people and growth of the middle class. And instead, what we've gotten is a China that habitually abuses the rules, does not have reciprocity in trade or investment, and dumps. I think in the case of the European Union, there has been a long-standing discussion between U.S. and European policymakers that in many areas hasn't gotten anywhere. But remember, by way of context, that the United States, our starting point to the European trade relationship after World War II was to lower our domestic trade barriers on a non-reciprocal basis to stimulate European economic growth, to build up alliances. What we have to do now is take a long, hard look at what we call the international economic order. And I think we have to confront imbalances that certainly are not good for taxpayers in the United States, and I would argue in the case of Chinese dumping, are not good for Europeans. So what my hope is that we will see the disputes right now act as a kind of doorway through which we can enter into more structured process for lowering regulatory and tariff barriers in the transatlantic trade relationship.
You don't need to answer, but it sounds an awful lot like you might hope that we end up close to where we would have been with TTIP in the first place. But let me just park that. You don't need to comment.
I'm not going to make any reference to the artist formerly known as TTIP.
Great. Understood. Question on Iran. You're right to say we have a shared interest in obviously stopping proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. But, you know, at the risk of being controversial, that does make us a bit light of the disagreements between us. We have a fairly substantive disagreement on how you get to the goal. And it's not been made easier by the fact that we have tried, even with the new administration, to address some of the new U.S. concerns that failed. And that's, you know, in diplomacy, having tried and failed is a bit of a setback that in some ways prepares us more poorly for the second round of debates. You've had a number of discussions already in Brussels today. You told me earlier, 9 trips, I believe, to Brussels in your few months as new Assistant Secretary of State. You're a frequent visitor here. What do you pick up in your conversations with European officials about an appetite for complete or partial renegotiation of the JCPOA?
Well, I think I've made 9 trips to Europe, and each of those trips, they've had anywhere from 4 to 8 stops, so I feel like I'm living on an airplane. I think I've been to Brussels so far 4 times. But to Europe a lot, and I've done that to engage our European allies to try to help them understand as best as possible some of these areas of disagreement, but also to chart a common way forward. And on Iran, I think what we have seen after months of conversations with European officials is that there is a broad agreement on the analysis of the Iranian problem. I would go a step further than that and say, for example, in Macron's trip to Washington, with the ideas that he brought for a comprehensive approach, very similar to what the United States has thought of in terms of next steps. I think what we want to arrive at, as Secretary Pompeo made clear in a recent speech at Heritage Foundation, is a new deterrence and non-proliferation framework to deal with the entirety of the problem. So a framework that allows the West to deal not only with ballistic missiles and Iranian influence, but also to encourage the aspirations of freedom among the Iranian people, and to provide a much clearer defense and deterrence of allies that we have in the Middle East, who, whatever the European allied views of JCPOA may have been, our closest allies in the Middle East did not see JCPOA as something that increased their security. The Israelis, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Gulf states. So we want a more comprehensive solution to this problem, and we believe if we neglect it, we're only fooling ourselves. I think the distance between us and our European allies on this is a distance that we will close. I'm optimistic about that. And I think the movement of European companies, the self-policing of European companies away from doing business in Iran, I think is the right decision. But I think it also points towards a closer U.S. and European diplomatic approach.
Switching tack slightly, I want to ask you about rule of law. It came up strongly in a speech you gave on another occasion at the Heritage Foundation when you described the strong rule of law as one of the things that makes the West unique. It is what distinguishes us from the rest. The European Union does have a concern about the continued quality or the quality of rule of law in a number of EU member states, and in fact there are proceedings underway against one of those. Where does the United States stand on the issue, and do you raise these difficult points if you share the analysis with your counterparts in questions when you meet them?
Well, we absolutely do, and I think if you look at President Trump's Warsaw speech, if you look at statements that have been made by Secretary Pompeo, if you read our latest human rights report from the State Department, I think it's very self-explanatory on where we stand. Democracy is who we are as a country. It's who we are as a civilization and as an alliance. We're absolutely clear on those values, and I've been clear about those in my public addresses. The Secretary has as well. I think we face a challenge right now that is profoundly ideological in a way we had not entirely anticipated after '89 with China and Russia. And in the National Security Strategy, the National Security Strategy outlines an objective of competing for positive influence. There are many regions of the world right now where the West and where the United States, we are losing strategic influence. We're losing strategic influence in Central and Eastern Europe, both inside and outside NATO and the EU. And I think the question becomes, how do you effectively compete for influence? The U.S. policies of the recent past, I would argue, with regard to Hungary and Poland, have not been successful in that regard. I think on the matter of Hungary, for example, my starting point is to say this is an ally, it's a NATO ally, it's a democratically elected government, and to look at Hungary and understand that we have to strike a balance between engagement and, where necessary, criticism. I think any close ally of the United States, we have disagreements with a lot of our allies. We try where possible to express those behind closed doors, but when necessary, we're public. I think that rule should apply. What I think won't work is an approach that would look at a country like Hungary, freeze it out from meetings or access, criticize it publicly for several years, and then expect that somehow we're going to retain influence. Expect that a country in those circumstances is still going to support Western pipelines or roll over Russia sanctions. And instead what we've seen, I think, across Central Europe is a measurable increase in Russian and Chinese influence. So we have to compete for influence. Criticism is not a strategy. There's a time and place for criticism, and we've been very clear in our principles, and will continue to be so. But diplomacy is about engagement. And I think you use diplomacy to listen, to engage, to find shared interests, and where necessary, also you use it for messaging opportunities. But in that regard, I think where we're at on Central and Eastern Europe is in many ways much closer to where many of the large Western European states are at in their relations with Hungary and with Poland. We follow very closely the disputes between certain Central and Eastern European states and the European Union. I think classically the U.S. approach has been to not get deeply involved in internal EU disputes, but we're crystal clear in where we stand in democracy and in support of rule of law, and will continue to be.
We're nearly out of time. I want to bring NATO into and defense into the debate, seeing a number of senior NATO representatives in a room. You have stated your hopes for the NATO summit, and many of those have already come to pass. The budgets have been going up. That's deliverable in a bag already, so to speak, to use diplomatic parlance. What are some of your fears about the NATO summit? What might go wrong?
I have literally no fears whatsoever about the NATO summit. No. Look, I'd say one of my fears right now in the lead up to the summit is I think we have to be very clear in a summit that is the 10th anniversary of the Bucharest Open Door Pledge. We have to be crystal clear that we're still in the business of engaging Ukraine and Georgia. And I am concerned in the lead up to the summit that we could send an unclear message, either because of the format of that meeting or because of the form that the statement takes. There are a couple of countries that we're working with inside the alliance who have concerns about expression of support. I think that's wrong. So one of my concerns would be if we can't break through that by the time of the summit and we're ambiguous in our support for Ukraine and Georgia, I think this would be a bad year to do that. On the South, projecting stability is a major step forward for the NATO alliance. President Trump at the Brussels leaders meeting last year called on NATO to get more into the counterterrorism business. We have a terrific story to tell about what NATO is doing and what the new initiatives that we're going to be launching. I'm concerned that certain countries in the alliance who have concerns about NATO getting into this business more deeply will play a blocking role, when instead I think what they should see is that both NATO and the EU need to coordinate and have a common position there. I think on burden sharing, we have a historic, positive story to tell about the scale of responsibilities, new responsibilities that NATO states are taking on. But I continue to be concerned that even with all of the urgent effort that has been made to express U.S. concerns about this, and we're not alone, others in the alliance have this concern, that Germany and other states will not bring forward a plan to meet 2%. This is a commitment that was made at Wales and at Brussels, and I think it's an important indication of seriousness about strategic competition. I am very pleased with the progress that's been made in Greece and Macedonia. The United States has been very involved in that from the beginning, and I think we're going to be at a good place by the time of the summit, but it's going to be an ongoing process. And I very much encourage our EU partners to keep the accession signal positive, because I think that's very important to reflect on the historic progress we've made. The Balkans, the impact on the Western Balkans will be tremendous as a result of this. So I think that's where we stand on NATO summit, but I'm optimistic that we'll have a very well-developed and successful agenda.
Yeah. Let's hope it stays that way. Assistant Secretary, I have literally a dozen additional questions on Turkey, on China, on climate change, but you are actually busy for the rest of the day of meetings with EAS officials, which would hate to stand in a way of. Let me thank you for not only finding the time to deliver this presentation, but also for continuing to place U.S. interest in a broader context of Western community and Western interest. And I think that continues to be a very important theme that we like to hear from Washington and from you personally. Thank you for finding the time, and thank you all for coming. And perhaps we can return to the issues that we haven't been able to address at one of your return appearances.
I'm happy to come back anytime.
Many thanks.
Thank you.